In the year 897, a dead man was put on trial, not metaphorically, not symbolically. His body was pulled from the grave, dressed in sacred vestments, propped upright in a chair, and made to answer for crimes he had committed while still among the living. The proceedings were formal. The accusations were read aloud. A lawyer was appointed to speak on the corpse's behalf, and at the head of it all sat a living pope, trembling with fury, screaming at a rotting cadaver that could not scream back. This is not myth. This is not folklore. This happened. And it tells us something terrible about what power does to the human mind. When it is cornered, humiliated, and desperate, to understand what broke inside that chamber in Rome, you have to understand what the papacy had become by the end of the 9th century. Because the institution that claimed dominion over the souls of all Christendom was, by 897, a wounded, bleeding thing, clawing for survival in a world that had turned viciously against it. The great Carolingian Empire of Charlemagne had fractured. The grand political architecture that had given the papacy its temporal backbone was collapsing into competing kingdoms, feuding warlords and regional lords who answered to no one. The city of Rome itself was barely recognizable as the spiritual capital of the Christian world. It was contested territory. It was a prize. It was a wound that powerful families fought over with money, with armies, and when those failed, with poison. Popes rose and fell with terrifying speed. Some were elected by the aristocracy. Some were installed by kings. Some clawed their way to the throne through sheer political ruthlessness. Some were deposed. Some were murdered. Some disappeared. The throne of St. Peter, once the most sacred seat in the known world, had become something closer to a hot coal. Whoever held it long enough to consolidate power was fortunate. Whoever held it too long was dangerous. Into this chaos stepped a man named Formosus. He had been a bishop of considerable learning and considerable ambition. He had served as a papal legate, traveled widely, cultivated relationships across the fractured political map of Europe. He was brilliant enough to earn powerful friends. He was ambitious enough to earn powerful enemies, and he was politically astute enough to survive multiple falls from grace, including a period of excommunication and exile that would have destroyed lesser men. He became pope in 891. Under Formosus, the papacy attempted something it desperately needed: stability. He crowned Lambert of Spoleto as Holy Roman Emperor. Then, troubled by Lambert's growing dominance over Rome, he invited the East Frankish king Arnulf of Carinthia to intervene, effectively inviting a foreign army into Italy to counterbalance a threat he himself had helped create. Arnulf obliged. He marched on Rome. He was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Formosus in 896. Formosus had now crowned two different men as Holy Roman Emperor. In the politics of the medieval church, this was not merely controversial. It was a wound that would never fully close. It implied one coronation was legitimate and the other was not. It created two rival claims to the most powerful secular title in the Christian world. And it planted a seed of retroactive delegitimization that someone, someday, would use as a weapon. Formosus died in April of 896. He had reigned for almost 5 years, an eternity by the standards of that era. He was buried with ceremony and mourning. The matter, it seemed, was closed. It was not closed. His name was Stephen VI. He became pope in May of 896, less than a month after the death of Formosus, and from almost the moment he assumed power, those around him noticed something unsettling about the new pontiff: a volatility, a fixation, a quality of attention when the subject of Formosus arose that bordered on the pathological. Stephen had been deeply allied with the House of Spoleto, the very political faction that Formosus had undermined by inviting Arnulf's intervention. Lambert of Spoleto, whom Formosus had first crowned and then effectively displaced, was still alive, still powerful, still furious. And Stephen VI was his creature, politically, personally, perhaps psychologically. Whether the obsession began as political strategy and curdled into something darker, or whether Stephen's enmity toward his predecessor was always personal in some way, history has not preserved. This we cannot know. What we know is the result. What we know is what Stephen did. He ordered the body of Formosus to be exhumed. The corpse had been in the ground for approximately 9 months by this point. 9 months in the cold Roman earth. The body of a man in his late 70s, already frail in his final months of life. What remained when the grave was opened is not difficult to imagine. Though every mind instinctively recoils from the imagining, Stephen did not recoil. He ordered the remains dressed in full papal vestments, the white cassock, the red mozzetta, the fisherman's ring replaced on fingers that would no longer hold it. He ordered the body propped in a chair at the front of a courtroom in the Basilica of St. John Lateran, the Cathedral Church of Rome, the seat of the Bishop of Rome, one of the holiest buildings in Christendom. He appointed a deacon to stand beside the corpse and serve as its legal advocate. Then he took his seat across from the dead man, and the Cadaver Synod began. Picture the room. It is winter, January of 897. The basilica is lit with torches and with the cold, guttering light of oil lamps. The assembled clergy sit in rows. Bishops, priests, deacons, functionaries of the papal court. Their faces arranged in the careful blankness of men who understand that their futures depend on the expression they wear. No one in that room is there by choice. Everyone in that room is terrified. The corpse sits in its chair at the front. The vestments are arranged as neatly as is possible. The papal tiara rests on the decomposed skull. The hands, or what remains of them, are positioned with the suggestion of ecclesiastical dignity. But 9 months of decomposition cannot be entirely concealed by ceremony, and the room is not large, and the January air inside is cold and still, and the smell is what it is. Stephen VI sits opposite. He begins to speak. What he says, what he shouts, what he hurls at the unmoving figure across the chamber, survives in fragmentary historical accounts that strain credulity even as they insist on their own accuracy. He accuses Formosus of having unlawfully assumed the papacy. He accuses him of having violated canonical law by transferring from one bishopric to another, a charge with technical ecclesiastical weight that served as the juridical skeleton of the proceedings. He accuses him of perjury. He accuses him of coveting the papacy through illegitimate means. He demands that the corpse answer. The appointed deacon, that anonymous figure standing beside a dead man, speaking on behalf of a dead man, in what must have been the most surreal and terrifying legal appointment in the history of Western jurisprudence, offers the required responses, carefully, quietly, with whatever restraint is available to a man who must choose his words knowing that each one could mark him as either a sympathizer of the condemned or an obstacle to the accuser's fury. Stephen does not find the responses satisfactory. He screams at the body. Contemporary accounts describe Stephen VI as having worked himself into a kind of frenzy, rising from his seat, gesturing wildly, his voice filling the stone chamber with accusations and denunciations directed at a man who had been 9 months dead. The assembled clergy watched. The deacon stood beside the body, and the corpse of Pope Formosus sat in its chair. wearing its stolen vestments, and said nothing, and changed nothing, and could not. This is the moment the historical record preserves, not the legal arguments, not the canonical citations. This, a living pope, screaming at a dead one, in a room full of men who understood that the entire thing was either the most important event in the Church's recent history, or the clearest possible sign that something had gone catastrophically wrong at the center of Christendom. Perhaps both. Perhaps that was always the point. To call it a trial implies a contest. There was no contest. The verdict was determined before the body was removed from the earth. Everyone in that room knew it. The deacon defending the corpse knew it. The bishops who would later sign the condemnation knew it. The guards who stood at the doors knew it. Stephen VI knew it. What the proceedings required was not justice. They required theater, legitimizing theater, the kind that transforms raw political will into something that wears the costume of law. If Formosus could be condemned by a duly constituted ecclesiastical court, then the condemnation of his acts while living could be made retroactively official. The 2 coronations he had performed could be declared invalid. Lambert of Spoleto's claim to the imperial title could be restored. The political architecture that Formosus had spent his papacy constructing could be dismantled, pillar by pillar, in a single afternoon. This was the logic. This was the mechanism. But something about the proceedings escaped the logic and the mechanism and became something else entirely. Something that the men in that room recognized but could not name. A collective awareness that the act they were participating in had crossed a threshold from which there was no dignified return. That the institution they served had done something to itself in that chamber that would not be easily undone. Formosus was found guilty on all charges. The vestments were torn from the body. The 3 fingers of his right hand used for consecration were cut off, severed from a corpse that had been in the ground for 9 months, a detail the mind reflexively refuses before accepting, as a final desecration of his priestly identity. The body was dressed in the clothes of a common layman. It was dragged through the streets of Rome, and it was thrown into the Tiber River. The papacy of Formosus was declared void. His ordinations were declared invalid. Every priest he had ordained, every bishop he had consecrated, every act performed under his authority, nullified, retroactively by decree of a court conducted over his decomposing remains. The trial lasted 1 day. History rarely allows such moments to stand without consequence. The people of Rome had watched. They had seen the body dragged through the streets. They had stood in silence, or not in silence, as the corpse of a pope was handled like refuse and committed to the river. And something in the collective psychology of the city shifted. Medieval Rome was not a gentle place. Its people had witnessed political violence, ecclesiastical corruption, and the spectacle of power consuming itself with a regularity that might have bred indifference. But the Cadaver Synod was something different. It violated something the city recognized even if it could not articulate, some boundary between the living and the dead, between sacred office and political weapon, between the exercise of power and the destruction of the institution that power claimed to protect. Riots broke out. The accounts are incomplete, as 9th century accounts tend to be. But the shape of what happened is clear enough. Stephen VI lost control of Rome. The popular revulsion was immediate and visceral. The political calculation that had driven the synod, the restoration of Spolitan influence, the invalidation of Formosan legacy, was overwhelmed by the simpler, more powerful reaction of a population that had been shown something it did not want to see. Within months of the trial, Stephen VI was himself arrested. He was stripped of his papal vestments. He was imprisoned. The historical record is typically spare about what happened in that prison, but it records the outcome with the blunt economy of a world accustomed to such outcomes. Stephen VI was strangled. He had reigned for a year and 1 month. The body of Formosus was recovered from the Tiber, reportedly by a monk who had seen a vision, which is how the 9th century processed the return of drowned bodies, and was reburied with full papal honors. The acts of the Cadaver Synod were declared invalid. The ordinations performed by Formosus were restored. The condemnation was, to the extent that these things can be undone, undone. But the church that emerged from the year 897 was not the church that had entered it. Something had been demonstrated in that chamber in the Lateran Basilica. Something about the fragility of institutional legitimacy, about the speed with which sacred authority can be weaponized, about the particular madness that results when political desperation is given the instruments of theological power and pointed at a helpless target. The target in this case had been utterly helpless. The target had been dead. And yet the proceedings had required every instrument of canonical formality: the vestments, the chair, the deacon, the charges, the verdict, the sentence, the mutilation, as if the living were more frightened of the dead man's legitimacy than of anything the living could produce. There is a reason this event has never been forgotten. Even in a century crowded with atrocities and collapses and institutional failures of every kind, it is not merely the grotesque spectacle of it, though the spectacle is undeniable, and the mind that encounters it for the first time feels something that is not quite shock and not quite revulsion, but sits between them, colder than either. It is what the spectacle reveals. The Cadaver Synod is the document of a system eating itself. It is the record of an institution that had accumulated so much power and had become so thoroughly entangled with the machinery of secular politics that it could no longer distinguish between its sacred function and its political survival. A pope was not on trial in that room. A symbol was. An act of political defiance was. A diplomatic calculation made by a man no longer alive to defend it was. But to put that symbol on trial, to make that act of defiance answerable, to force that diplomatic calculation to submit to condemnation, the only way to accomplish any of it was to dig up the man who had made those decisions and dress him in the clothes he had worn while making them. Which is what they did, which tells you everything. Because the act itself, regardless of what it accomplished politically, and it accomplished very little in the end, for the Spolitan cause it was meant to serve, the act itself is a confession written in decomposition and torn vestments, and the screaming voice of a man who needed his predecessor to be guilty badly enough to conduct a trial against his skeleton. Stephen VI needed Formosus to answer for what he had done, needed it badly enough to override every ordinary human instinct about the dead, every ecclesiastical protocol about the dignity of the papal office, every political calculation about what such a spectacle would do to public confidence in the institution he led. He needed it. That need is the most disturbing thing in this entire story. More disturbing than the exhumation, more disturbing than the severed fingers or the body thrown into the river. The need, the hunger, the particular quality of obsession that looks at a grave and sees not a resting place, but an unfinished argument. The Tiber runs through Rome still. The basilica still stands. rebuilt and rebuilt across the centuries, its floors walked by millions of pilgrims who do not think of January 897, who do not think of a chair at the front of the room and the figure placed in it. The office of the papacy has survived a millennium and more since the night Stephen VI looked across a courtroom at his predecessor's corpse and felt, in some chamber of his mind, that justice was being served. The institution survived. Institutions almost always do, which is either a comfort or an indictment, depending on how clearly you look at what they survive. But that room, that particular room on that particular winter day, with the torches and the smell and the assembled clergy and the deacons standing beside a dead man and finding words, that room does not entirely go away. It stays somewhere at the edge of the historical record, in the footnotes and the primary sources and the quiet accounts of chroniclers who set down what they heard without quite believing it. A dead man on trial, a living man screaming at the dead, and a room full of witnesses who understood, in the part of themselves beneath ideology and political allegiance and institutional loyalty, that what they were watching was not justice, that it was something else, something that had no clean name then and doesn't now, something that lives in the precise overlap between power and madness, in that narrow, lightless space where one becomes indistinguishable from the other, and a man sitting across from his predecessor's remains cannot see the difference and cannot stop.